Welcome to Noisy Mind Podcast.
Great to be here.
If you're finding these explorations into important global topics valuable, please take a moment right now to subscribe to the Noisy Mind channel.
Yeah, it really does help us out.
It really does. And if you like what you hear, giving us a thumbs up and sharing this discussion with others who might be interested, that would be fantastic.
Absolutely. So today we're diving into, well, the really intricate relationship between the U.S. and the EU when it comes to semiconductors.
A huge topic right now.
It is. We'll be looking at recent reports, analyses, trying to understand the challenges, the opportunities, especially with global security and tech competition in the background.
And those big initiatives, the U.S. CHIPS Act, the EU CHIPS Act, they fit in here somewhere.
Exactly. We'll touch on those and what they mean for working together across the Atlantic. Basically, our aim today is to pull out the key info, give you a clear picture, without drowning you in tech speak.
Okay, let's get into it. Our sources point to some pretty serious concerns, particularly around potential global disruptions. What are the big risks tied to relying so heavily on Taiwan for chips?
Right. That's probably the number one vulnerability highlighted, the sheer concentration of advanced chip making, especially the most cutting-edge stuff in Taiwan.
TSMC, mainly.
TSMC, yes.
Yeah.
They produce, estimates vary, but maybe 90% of the super advanced chips.
Yeah.
So the worry is, any instability there, especially involving China, could just choke off the supply of these critical components. Bloomberg Economics actually put a number on it, didn't they? Something like a potential war over Taiwan could cost the global economy.
Yeah.
I think it was $10 trillion.
$10 trillion. That's staggering.
It is. And while, maybe a direct military strike just on chip facilities is less likely, the analysts argue, the disruption to supply chains alone, the economic fallout, that's the massive concern for both Washington and Brussels. That potential for catastrophic economic damage.
That really paints a stark picture, the sheer economic vulnerability linked to the Taiwan Strait and these advanced chips. So, given this dependence, what are the key questions popping up about how the U.S. and EU can actually work together to lessen these risks? What are people asking?
That's the core question, really. How do they deepen, broaden? How do they leverage joint activities effectively? The CHIPS Acts, both the U.S. and EU versions, they show everyone recognizes the problem.
Okay.
They share that strategic goal, build up domestic capacity. But the questions are how? How do you best incentivize bringing advanced manufacturing back or building it anew?
Onshoring, right.
Onshoring, yeah. How do you foster the right kind of innovation? And crucially, build supply chains that are more resilient, maybe more spread out geographically. It's about aligning these big pushes. The U.S. one, the EU one, so they don't just duplicate efforts wastefully.
Yeah.
Making sure they actually add up.
It really does sound like a complex puzzle, lots of moving parts.
Yeah.
And Taiwan itself, its role must be shifting, too. With all this geopolitical pressure, the U.S.-China chip fight, what questions are emerging about Taiwan's own long-term game plan?
Yeah, Taiwan is walking a very, very fine line. Their ecosystem, Hisinchu Science Park and all that.
Yeah.
And it's a massive competitive advantage built over decades.
Decades, right.
But the big question now is, how do they keep that edge? With the U.S. and the EU pouring money into their own industries and the constant U.S.-China tech tension, a key thing people ask is about talent. Can Taiwan hold on to its top engineers, its researchers, when other countries are basically offering big money to build up their own chip sectors?
The brain drain concern.
Exactly. And then there's the TSMC question. They're building fabs elsewhere, Arizona, maybe Germany. Diversifying, yeah. Just sounds good for supply chain resilience, right? But from Taiwan's perspective, the question is, does that dilute their strategic importance? Does it make them, less indispensable? And could that maybe affect U.S. support down the line? It's a real dilemma for them.
That's a fascinating angle, the strategic implications of spreading out that leading-edge production. Okay, let's pivot slightly to the U.S.-China dynamic. The sources really emphasize the impact of U.S. export controls on chips going to China.
Yeah.
What are the main challenges and questions coming out of that part of the story?
Well, those U.S. controls, they've definitely thrown a spanner in the works for China's semiconductor ambitions, no question.
How so, specifically?
It's raised serious doubts about their ability, at least in the near term, to make the really advanced chips themselves, the sub-7, sub-10 nanometer stuff. They just can't easily get the cutting-edge equipment and tech anymore.
So the small yard, high fence strategy is biting.
It seems to be. Despite, massive government investment in China, They still seem to be facing a pretty significant tech gap with the leaders like TSMC or Samsung. It makes you question the long-term effectiveness of that top-down, state-driven approach in such a fast-moving, complex industry, especially when you're cut off from key global tech inputs.
And beyond just China's own capabilities, what about the wider global impact? Are there broader challenges, maybe unintended consequences, or questions arising from these U.S. policies targeting China's chip sector?
Oh, definitely. This whole U.S. policy push is reshaping the entire global semiconductor map. It's leading towards, well, a more fragmented system, probably less efficient overall, some analysts think.
Fragmented how?
Companies everywhere are rethinking their supply chains, hedging their bets against geopolitical risk, diversifying, which is why you see TSMC building in the U.S., Samsung expanding. Everyone's responding. It's creating these new potential manufacturing hubs spurred on by the CHIPS Acts in the U.S. and EU.
But that could lead to problems too.
Possibly.
Hmm.
One question is about potential overcapacity down the road. If everyone builds lots of fabs, maybe for slightly older chip types, without careful coordination, you could end up with a glut.
Okay.
And then there's the other big question, retaliation.
Hmm.
Could China hit back, especially against countries in the region like Japan or South Korea, if they align too closely with U.S. chip policies? There's history there. China using economic leverage. That's a definite risk people are watching, a real war-related concern, even if not direct conflict.
That makes sense. And speaking of trade friction, the sources mention new U.S. tariffs on Chinese imports. How might those play into this? Could they complicate things for U.S.-EU cooperation on semiconductors?
Yeah, that's a really interesting and frankly uncertain point right now. These new tariffs, especially hitting sectors like cars, which have deeply intertwined U.S.-EU supply chains.
Right, lots of chips in cars.
Exactly. It could definitely create friction. There's a concern, that these kinds of unilateral trade actions might actually undermine the shared goals on securing chip supplies or managing tech competition with China together.
So a potential conflict between different policy tools.
Potentially. The big question is, will this tariff focus push the U.S. and EU closer together on China tech policy overall, or will it drive them apart? Does it lead to more alignment on export controls, investment screening, or does it create new disagreements? It definitely raises the stakes for needing closer coordination, especially on who gets access to which semiconductor tech. That's a key fact point analysts are raising.
And another layer of uncertainty mentioned is the potential impact of future U.S. administrations, maybe a return of the Trump administration. What questions does that raise for U.S.-EU alignment on tech trade and China policy?
That's another major fact hanging over everything. Would a different U.S. administration seek greater alignment with the EU on these high-tech trade and sanctions issues with China, perhaps focusing more narrowly on security? Or would it lead to more misalignment, maybe prioritizing bilateral deals or even seeing the EU as more of an economic competitor in some areas? There's just a lot of uncertainty there, and it adds another layer of complexity to long-term strategic planning for both sides.
Absolutely. So much flux. Okay, let's try to bring some of this together. We've covered the driving forces, the acts themselves, the Taiwan situation, the U.S.-China tech war. When you step back and look at all this information, what are the really crucial takeaways for now?
Well, I think the main thing is that we're seeing a global industry in profound transformation. It's being reshaped by technology needs, yes, but maybe even more so by geopolitics right now.
Geopolitics driving tech.
Very much so. The U.S. and EU clearly see similar threats, similar vulnerabilities in their chip supply chains. They're trying to fix it with these big parallel strategies, the CHIPS Acts, but they're not identical strategies.
We talked about those differences, funding, state aid rules.
Exactly. And navigating those differences, plus all the regulations, the sheer complexity of collaborating internationally while these big geopolitical tensions are playing out,
Yeah.
it's a huge challenge.
And Taiwan.
Taiwan remains absolutely central and vulnerable. That hasn't changed. And the U.S.-China tech competition. That's the engine driving so much of this realignment. It's pushing towards that more fragmented global landscape, forcing companies and countries to pick sides or at least hedge their bets. We're seeing new manufacturing hubs emerge because of it.
So for you, the listeners, you've been following along, maybe the big aha moment is just grasping how deeply interconnected this all is. Semiconductors aren't just tech components.
Not at all.
They're tied directly to economic stability, national security, even the global balance of power. The stakes are incredibly high.
Spot on. And maybe a final thought to leave you with, a question to mull over. We're seeing this trend, this push towards maybe a more split, bifurcated global tech world. Nations are scrambling to secure their own chip supplies.
Right.
So thinking ahead, maybe 5, 10 years, What unforeseen challenges or maybe even unexpected opportunities might pop up because of this massive technological reshuffling? What new breakthroughs or geopolitical shifts could completely change the game for US-EU semiconductor collaboration and this whole global picture we've been discussing today?
Something definitely worth thinking about.